He was mocked the moment he walked in, labeled a delivery man, laughed at in front of security, told he looked more like someone who buffed floors than built strategy, then humiliated in a glass-walled conference room by executives who asked if he could even read his own resume. They judged him by his skin before they heard a single word. They saw a black man and decided he didn't belong. What they didn't see was the storm behind his silence, or the empire behind his eyes. This isn't just another story about discrimination. It's a reckoning dressed as a job interview. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit subscribe and stay with us. Tell us where you're watching from, and which moment made your jaw drop. You think you know where this is going. You don't. The lobby of Eltridge and Keene glistened in the mid-morning light like a showroom. Sleek glass walls, modern art installations, and that faint scent of citrus-polished tile mixed with corporate sterility. At exactly 8:14 a.m., Alaric Boone walked in, his leather dress shoes silent against the stone floor, his profile calm and composed, his dark wool suit tailored to precision. He paused at the front desk, where a young receptionist with pale pink lipstick sat scrolling through her phone, AirPods in, fingers tapping mindlessly. Alaric stood politely, waiting for her attention. When she finally looked up, she didn't ask his name or intention. She barely blinked. Her eyes glanced quickly over his broad shoulders, his deep brown skin, and the callous-free hands clasped in front of him. Without a word, she tilted her head toward the hallway behind her and said with a practiced flatness that the catering team usually entered through the back kitchen entrance. He didn't respond. Not immediately. Just raised a single brow, unsure whether she was joking or trying to insult him without making it obvious. He calmly stated he was there for the 8:30 strategy director interview. Her expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, bemusement, maybe disbelief, passed across her face. She asked if he had ID. Not a name, not a question about the appointment, just ID, like she was checking for trespassers, not talent. Before he could answer, a click of heels cut across the tile behind him. Lucinda Griggs entered the room like a gust of superiority cloaked in a tailored white pantsuit. She was tall, sharp-faced, and carried herself like someone who believed she could smell mediocrity before it opened its mouth. The receptionist stood up straighter as Lucinda passed, but the HR executive's eyes were already locked on Alaric. She took in his height, the understated suit, the tight fade above his ears, and smirked. Loud enough for the guards near the elevator to hear, she chuckled and said, "If this is a delivery guy, at least he's dressed for the boardroom." The guards snorted, one of them adding something about uniforms being too formal these days. Lucinda turned to the receptionist and asked where the catering boxes were, then tilted her chin at Alaric as if expecting him to explain himself. When he answered again, calm, direct, and without raising his voice, that he was here for the strategy interview, Lucinda's eyebrows arched high like she was watching someone do a magic trick. "You're early," she said finally, almost suspiciously. "I suppose the rest of the kitchen staff are coming later?" The receptionist gave a quiet laugh. One of the guards actually whistled. Alaric didn't smile. He didn't frown. He stood motionless, his hands still clasped in front of him, face unreadable. Years in business had taught him restraint was sometimes more powerful than rebuttal. At 8:23, a tall white man with rolled-up sleeves and a flimsy nylon portfolio entered the building. Lucinda's tone shifted entirely. She greeted him by name, Colin, offered a handshake, and asked if he wanted coffee or tea. The receptionist stood to buzz someone on the second floor, telling them the first candidate has arrived. Alaric remained invisible. Lucinda didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask about his resume. She simply waved him toward the lounge chairs and told the receptionist to let housekeeping know this gentleman's waiting by the glass. Alaric blinked. Not from shock, from calculation. He made no move. He didn't sit. He didn't argue. He simply asked once more, with exact clarity, to be checked in for the 8:30 interview under the name Alaric Boone. That got a pause. A flicker of confusion behind Lucinda's practiced poise. She asked Tracy to check again. When the name did pop up in the interview roster, Lucinda's face didn't flush. Alaric Boone was still standing exactly where she had left him, unmoving, unreadable, like a statue carved to endure scrutiny. Her heels tapped crisply on the tile as she approached him again, pausing just close enough to be confrontational, but not quite enough for civility. She looked him over, this time slower, with a deliberate drag of her eyes from his polished shoes to the knot of his tie, then back down again. Her mouth curved in mock curiosity, as if she were trying to identify the fabric. Then came the words, too light to be kind, but too sharp to be accidental. "You dress well," she said, voice cool, though I would have chosen something less off the rack. The pause before the last phrase landed like a slap. Alaric didn't blink, but inside, something shifted. She wasn't criticizing the suit. She was undermining the legitimacy of everything it represented. Before he could respond, a man with a clipboard walked into the lobby from the elevator bay, mid-40s, blazer stretched tight around his midsection, a badge that read Director of Operations clipped to his breast pocket. He took one look at Alaric, frowned, then turned to Lucinda. "Is he supposed to be up here?" the man asked, his voice low but unconcerned with discretion. "I thought we were locking down the mezzanine access today. He doesn't look like he has clearance." Lucinda, without even glancing at Alaric, replied that he was supposedly a candidate for the strategy position, though she hadn't had time to verify his paperwork. The man nodded slowly, his gaze returning to Alaric as if trying to memorize his face for later reporting. "Should I alert Paul at security?" he asked. "Just in case." Lucinda tilted her head in mock thought, then waved him off with a dismissive flick of the wrist. "Let's see if he makes it past the first round before we waste Paul's time," she said. Her tone made it clear. She still didn't believe he belonged. Her smile was tight, her gaze narrowing like she was daring him to react. Behind her, the elevator dinged again and another candidate exited, a woman in heels too high for comfort and a skirt that said networking more than competence. Lucinda beamed and stepped forward to greet her, leaving Alaric in her wake like abandoned luggage. Two junior associates walked by next, both white men in their early 20s, whispering just loud enough to be heard. "You see that guy," one muttered. "Looks like he wandered in from a loading dock." The other chuckled. "Probably here to shadow housekeeping. Maybe he got the wrong tower." Their laughter echoed through the corridor like cheap applause, and still Alaric stood, unbending but not unaffected. His posture was exact, but inside his chest, pressure began to build. A cold, compact anger that didn't boil or explode, but hardened slowly like stone under weight. The meeting rooms along the mezzanine were all glass-fronted, designed for transparency, accountability, and the illusion of inclusion. From his position, Alaric could see the other candidates being ushered in one by one. None of them looked like him. None were asked to verify their presence. None were told to wait indefinitely without explanation. The receptionist passed by once more with a new guest badge and avoided his gaze like his presence was contagious. A young intern, possibly new enough not to know better, offered him a bottled water without sarcasm. He declined again, this time with a smile so controlled it could cut granite. Across the lobby, Lucinda whispered something to Brenna, who laughed and covered her mouth. The gesture seemed reflexive, but betrayed nothing of surprise, only cruelty veiled in corporate etiquette. At 8:55, when Colin exited the conference room, shaking hands and grinning like he had already landed the role, Lucinda nodded and told him they would be in touch soon. She gestured to Alaric then, not to invite him in, but to comment on him like art hanging too long in the wrong gallery. "He's still here," she said to Brenna, loud enough for Colin to hear. "Persistent, I'll give him that." Brenna replied something about drive being admirable in certain contexts. Colin smirked and offered a final glance at Alaric that lingered on the lapels of his suit, as if confirming Lucinda's earlier suspicion about rented style. No one had asked for his resume. No one had offered a room. No one had said he was actually on the schedule. They let him stand like a misplaced file in an inbox no one wanted to open. And in doing so, they revealed exactly who they were, not guardians of professionalism, but gatekeepers of prejudice disguised in expensive tailoring. Alaric glanced at the conference room, then at his watch. He had been waiting over 40 minutes, without even a nod of acknowledgement from the hiring panel. His name was on the roster. His background had already passed screening. But his skin, his stature, his silent confidence, those were the only metrics being measured now. But Alaric stood his ground, not out of defiance, but out of practiced patience. He had been here before in different cities, behind different walls, always watching how power chose who got invited in and who was made to wait. A new wave of candidates arrived from the elevator, all variations of the same archetype, neatly dressed, effortlessly confident, and unmistakably connected. They laughed too loud and shook hand with ease, slapping shoulders and offering lines like I'm only here because my mentor insisted. A blonde intern named Seth emerged from the hallway, with a silver tray balanced, in one hand, bottled water and glass tumblers, gleaming like trophies under the recessed lighting. Seth scanned the room with cheerful focus, offering drinks to the group that had just walked in, engaging them by name. He handed a bottle to Colin, who was lingering even after his interview, then passed another to a woman in a red blazer whose resume barely hid the logo of a competitor firm. Seth moved through the candidates, complimenting a tie here, offering a quiet nod there. But when he approached Alaric's corner of the lobby, he slowed. He didn't stop. His eyes passed over Alaric like he was part of the decor, an abstract object that didn't require service or acknowledgement. The tray dipped slightly, then veered left, and Alaric was skipped like a smudge in the floor plan. Seth offered the final bottle to a candidate leaning against the window. The tray now empty, the intern disappeared down the corridor without a backward glance. Alaric's jaw flexed once. His throat was dry, but his voice, had he chosen to use it, would have been steady. He kept still, watching the way the receptionist laughed a little too easily at a passing joke, the way her eyes brightened when Darren, the second candidate, complimented her nails. None of them noticed the stillness of the man they refused to see. At 9:12, a regional logistics manager named Clark Forney exited the elevator bank, moving with the kind of middle-tier swagger that comes from just enough power to be feared by interns, but never enough to be invited to real strategy meetings. Clark was nursing a coffee and scrolling through his phone when he spotted Alaric. His eyes narrowed in suspicion before his mouth twisted into an amused smile. Without slowing, he leaned toward Lucinda, who was reviewing a report with Brenna near the hallway. Clark's voice wasn't loud, but he knew how to make it carry. "We opening a soup kitchen in the lobby now," he said, smirking. "Looks like we're giving out scholarships and bottled water." The laughter came quickly. Brenna gave a high, sharp laugh like she didn't mean to, and Lucinda, never one to miss a moment of subtle degradation, let out a single amused exhale before replying. "Charity starts at the door, I suppose." Clark kept walking, pleased with himself, disappearing into a side corridor. The air afterward was lighter for everyone except Alaric. The receptionist glanced over, unsure if she should laugh again. She chose to refresh her lipstick instead. Seth passed by a second time and still didn't offer a bottle. A man in a blue checkered jacket sat down nearby, scrolling through job listings and chuckling at Alaric like he knew something. Across the lobby, the sun rose higher, casting angular shadows that made the glass look like cracked crystal. Alaric shifted his weight slightly, his legs beginning to stiffen, but his posture remained controlled. There was no slump in his shoulders, no visible frustration. But the weight of the stares, the ones that slid away when met, the ones that lingered just long enough to judge, settled like dust across his collar. He pulled out a pen from his breast pocket, uncapped it, and began to write a single word in his notepad, one clean stroke at a time. No one asked what he was doing. No one came near. To them, he had faded into the fixtures, like the planter beside the elevator or the decorative water wall humming softly in the background. At 9:20, Lucinda reappeared, standing near the security checkpoint, reading a message on her phone. She called out a name, Darren's name. He had already been interviewed, but she waved him back in for a follow-up round. Darren shot Alaric a grin that wasn't unkind, but definitely not neutral. "Hang in there," he muttered as he passed. "You'll get your shot." It wasn't empathy. It was pity. And pity, Alaric knew, was just a softer form of power. The kind that didn't bruise, but eroded. Another receptionist shift change occurred at 9:27. The new front desk attendant, Isaiah, paused briefly when he saw Alaric still standing alone. Isaiah's expression tightened, the faintest flicker of discomfort in his eyes. But like the others, he said nothing. He took his seat, logged in, and began answering internal messages. No one had asked him to check the candidate list. No one had suggested they follow up on the man who'd been waiting since 8:14. Inside the interview suite, the air was colder, the lights harsher. A long oak table stretched beneath recessed spotlights, surrounded by 5 executives already seated and speaking in low tones. Their voices hushed the moment Alaric entered. Lucinda introduced him with clinical brevity, his name, his former title, and a pointed mention that he was a non-traditional applicant. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her tone had already said everything she believed. Alaric sat at the far end of the table, across from a man named Grayson Holt, the director of corporate strategy, whose forehead glistened with impatience and whose cufflinks gleamed like metals. To his right, a younger woman in an emerald dress tapped a stylus against her tablet and barely looked up. On his left, an older man with thick glasses leaned forward, examining a copy of Alaric's resume like it had been printed in code. The first to speak was Holt. He asked where Alaric had earned his degree. Alaric answered. Holt nodded, unimpressed, and flicked his eyes to the man beside him. That man, Elliot Duval, VP of Finance, held up the resume and tilted his head, squinting at the formatting. "Who prepared this for you?" he asked, tone flat. "It's clean, concise, not what I expected." The compliment, if one could call it that, came wrapped in a question that reeked of disbelief. "Did you write it yourself?" he added, his brow furrowed. Alaric answered yes, that he did. Duval smiled faintly, then asked, "And you're sure you're fluent in English?" The room didn't gasp. No one protested. The emerald-dressed woman stifled a cough behind her hand. Lucinda looked down at her notes and said nothing. Grayson moved on to the next question, as if nothing unusual had been said. They asked him to describe his approach to strategic realignment across multi-regional divisions. He answered clearly, citing projects from his time as a regional growth advisor and referencing P&L cycles, operational redundancy, and cross-market adaptation. He used numbers. He quoted KPIs. He presented insight. But somewhere during the third response, Lucinda cut in. Her voice was smooth, almost amused. "Mr. Boone," she said, "do you understand this is a senior management position?" Alaric paused, then replied that he did. "Because the way you're explaining these metrics," she continued, "sounds more like someone describing security routes in a parking lot." There was a long, thick silence. Lucinda smiled, as if she'd made a clever joke. No one laughed, but no one pushed back either. Alaric's lips pressed into a line, and he continued, choosing not to respond to the jab. He talked about vendor reconciliation at scale, how he had negotiated a restructuring agreement that reduced net loss by 8% across 3 quarters. But the more he spoke, the less they listened. Holt tapped his pen. Duval checked his phone. The woman in emerald leaned back in her chair and yawned, not bothering to hide it. Midway through a question about team delegation, someone knocked gently on the conference door and slipped inside. A white male associate in shirt sleeves who walked directly to Lucinda and whispered into her ear. She nodded, then stood and said they'd be wrapping up soon. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Boone," she added without warmth. "We'll be in touch." The message was clear. This was not an invitation to stay longer or clarify anything. This was a dismissal. Alaric stood slowly, collected his notepad, and gave a curt nod to the panel. As he reached the door, Grayson offered a half-hearted good luck, without looking up. Lucinda followed him out into the hallway, where she paused briefly as if wanting to say something. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, smiled like a hostess seeing off an unwanted guest, and turned to greet the next candidate approaching from the other direction, a man who walked like he belonged and was treated as if he already did. Only when the doors opened onto the lobby did he shift slightly, stepping forward with the same precision he had carried in, though the air around him now seemed heavier, thicker with the weight of every unspoken word left behind. As he passed the front desk, neither of the 2 new receptionists acknowledged him. They were laughing quietly over something on a tablet, their expressions light, careless, completely detached from a storm that had just swept through the upper floors. Alaric crossed the marble floor with slow purpose, not dragging his steps, but placing them. He approached the revolving doors, paused briefly beneath the overhead lights, then adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve with practiced ease before stepping outside into the daylight. The moment the door spun shut behind him, Lucinda Griggs reappeared at the end of a hallway upstairs, heels clicking against tile, as she made her way back toward the interview room. Her assistant Brenna followed close behind, tablet in hand, brows raised as if seeking instruction. Lucinda turned to her, exhaling sharply and shaking her head with theatrical disapproval. "He was confident," Brenna said, keeping her tone light but cautious. Lucinda scoffed, waved her hand like brushing away lint. "Confident is not the word," she replied, voice carrying louder than necessary. "Try delusional." She stopped near the coffee station, poured herself half a cup, then added, "If someone like that ever actually made it into our strategy team, I'd hand in my badge and walk out." The words hung in the air, brittle and contemptuous, meant more for the hallway than for Brenna. A junior associate down the corridor glanced up and raised his brows. No one looked surprised. No one protested. They all had their own Lucindas in different forms, at different levels. They had simply learned to stay quiet. Lucinda took a long sip, adjusted her sleeve, and continued. "He can talk metrics all he wants, but let's be honest, he didn't look like leadership." Brenna hesitated, then forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Lucinda didn't notice. Unbeknownst to either of them, seated on the far bench beside the internal comms room was Seth, the same intern who had skipped Alaric with the water tray, the same one who had laughed along with the others when Clark Forney made his charity comment. Now Seth sat alone, tablet in hand, reviewing files, checking his to-do list. But in the upper right corner of his screen was a thumbnail, silent, clear, focused, of the security footage from the panel room upstairs. Seth had activated recording mode earlier as part of his intern documentation process, intended to create onboarding highlights for internal HR presentations. But instead of capturing professional excellence, it had caught a different kind of culture entirely. Every word, every smirk, every dismissive glance. Lucinda's comment about parking lot security, Elliot Duvall's question about reading English, the condescending tone, the casual cruelty. And now this, Lucinda declaring she would rather resign than work beside a man like Alaric Boone. Seth tapped the screen once, then twice, locking the footage into the private archive folder he had accidentally made public last week while submitting another project. The file sat now in a shared directory, visible only to upper-tier admin, but one email away from traveling further. Back outside, Alaric reached the edge of the corporate plaza and paused beside a stone pillar etched with the company's vision statement. His eyes didn't drift to it. He knew the words already. He had read them on the website, on the recruitment brochure, on the walls inside every office, hallway. Empowerment, innovation, inclusion. He had heard those words echoed a dozen times across industries, all of them delivered with smiles, all of them discarded the moment someone like him challenged the template. He removed his phone from his pocket, checked the time, and noted the exact minute he exited the building. Then, with slow precision, he pulled a card from his interior jacket pocket, thicker than most, matte black, embossed not with a logo, but with a single set of initials. He ran a thumb over them once, then placed it back. He walked the curb and waited. Back in the building, Lucinda and her team prepared for the next round. Another candidate entered the room, this one exuding all the traditional polish, Ivy League credentials, father on the board of a partner firm, LinkedIn posts that generated executive engagement. No one questioned his resume. No one asked him if he wrote it. As the door shut behind them, the camera in the corner of the room, standard internal recording, blinked once, registering another active session. But the moment Alaric passed beyond the security cameras, a subtle shift had already begun rippling inside. Upstairs, Lucinda Griggs returned to the HR suite with a spring in her stride, sipping iced coffee and humming under her breath, pleased to have endured yet another morning of interviews without having to pretend she cared about change. She passed by the open door to Brenna's office, leaned in, and said with a smirk that the last candidate, the diversity hire that never was, had finally exited. Brenna looked up but didn't respond. She had already reviewed the calendar and saw there were no further interviews that afternoon, only follow-up reviews to process. Lucinda stretched, flicked her nails against the side of her tablet, and added in a louder voice, "If he's got friends who know how to run floor buffers, we could use help in facilities." The line landed like a dart. A few employees down the hall laughed, unsure whether they were supposed to. One assistant leaned out of her office and raised her brows, but Lucinda was already moving, waving a hand as if her own joke amused her more than it should have. She didn't notice that the intern Seth, now seated at a hot desk near the break area, had paused his typing. He heard the comment. He heard the laughter. And though his hands hovered over the keyboard, he didn't type a word. The file he'd sent to the HR archive an hour earlier had just bounced back, not as an error, but flagged for executive attention. He didn't know that yet, but someone else did. As Alaric re-entered the building's lower level from the plaza's far entrance, technically the service corridor, he did so deliberately, bypassing the main lobby and walking through the back hallway, where catering staff wheeled linen-draped carts and janitorial trolleys passed quietly under the hum of fluorescent lights. His footsteps echoed through the narrow service hallway, not hurried, not uncertain. He wasn't sneaking in. He was observing. From this angle, the building showed its spine, the hidden structure beneath the polish. Workers who were invisible in the boardrooms moved with quiet urgency. No one questioned his presence. He blended in only because he chose not to be seen. Meanwhile, in the main hallway near the executive elevators, 3 junior associates leaned near the corner windows whispering. One, a recent MBA with neatly parted hair and a pinched expression, said he'd seen that guy come out of the interview suite. "You mean the one with the heavy build?" the second added. "Yeah," said the first, lowering his voice to a near-mocking whisper. "For a second, I thought he was part of the banquet setup. Thought he was asking for the service elevator." They laughed under their breath, not because the joke was clever, but because ridicule created comfort in shared silence. The third, a woman in a blue shift dress, murmured that he looked lost when he came out. "Wrong tower, maybe?" The others nodded, one adding that maybe he was one of the hotel staff from the adjoining conference center. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his title, but they knew what he wasn't, and to them that was enough. Across the hallway, Lucinda caught the end of their exchange and smiled. She didn't correct them. She didn't clarify that Alaric had been a legitimate candidate. Instead, she chimed in casually, saying it's always a little awkward when someone sneaks into the wrong tier of the ecosystem. The word ecosystem made the others laugh harder, as if the company were a carefully curated habitat and Alaric had entered as a foreign species. As the comments faded, the day proceeded as planned. Lunchtime meetings resumed. Slide decks were rehearsed. Performance reviews were discussed with rehearsed empathy. And on the 21st floor, a conference call was interrupted by an unexpected alert on the managing director's tablet. It was from Legal and Compliance. Attached was a flagged audio-visual file pulled from the internal training archive, with a summary that read, "Potential breach of ethical interview conduct. Review requested." The MD paused, frowned, and opened the file, expecting a typical documentation error. Instead, the screen lit up with a video of a conference room, angle steady, audio clear. Lucinda's voice, Duval's comment, every smirk, every dismissal, every microaggression layered in corporate gloss. The MD hit pause, then rewind, then sat still for 30 seconds before tapping a single line to the executive compliance officer. "You need to see this. Today." Back in the HR suite, Lucinda finished a meeting and returned to her office to find a calendar invite from the general counsel marked urgent. She blinked, then frowned. Her smile slipped just slightly, but not enough to show concern. She clicked open the time. 45 minutes from now. No subject, no context, just a room number and 3 names. One of them was the chief ethics officer. One of them was from legal. The third was from the parent company's investment division. He did not speak for the first several blocks, his posture relaxed yet unshakably still, his gaze fixed on the rhythm of motion beyond the tinted glass, until the car reached a quiet stretch beneath a row of glass towers overlooking the financial corridor. There, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim black phone, one that bore no apps, no social icons, only numbers programmed to reach very specific people. He tapped a single contact, lifted the phone to his ear, and said calmly into the receiver, "It's confirmed. Proceed." Then he ended the call without waiting for a reply and returned the phone to his pocket as if he had just checked the time. 10 blocks away, in a secured conference suite on the top floor of the building Alaric had just left, a different kind of meeting began. The emergency board session was called with no agenda, no summary, only a subject line marked Directive, Level 1. Within minutes, the CEO, CFO, General Counsel, and 3 board members of Eltridge and Keene were summoned from lunch reservations, external site visits, and private lounges. Their reactions varied: confusion, irritation, curiosity. But none of them declined the meeting. By the time they arrived, the doors had already been secured, and waiting inside was a representative from the parent firm's primary investment partner, Stonehaven Capital Group. The representative did not introduce himself with a name, only credentials, and a simple statement delivered without flourish. There has been a breach of fiduciary ethics related to executive operations and M&A conduct. I've been authorized to act on behalf of our principal. There was no projector, no slide deck, no preamble. He held a single remote, tapped a button, and played a 15-minute video taken directly from the building's own internal HR documentation system. The faces of the board slowly shifted from mild discomfort to outright alarm as the voices of Lucinda Griggs, Elliot Duval, and other executives filled the room, unfiltered, unedited, unmistakable. One board member leaned forward with growing tension when Lucinda's voice rang out with chilling clarity, announcing she would resign if someone like Alaric ever made it onto her team. The silence that followed the footage was heavier than shame. The Stonehaven representative waited 3 seconds, then said, "Your acquisition is under reevaluation." The CEO attempted to respond, voice calm but already cracking, asking who the complainant was and whether the clip had been manipulated. The representative raised one brow and replied, "That man you humiliated? He's our director of integration strategy, retained to conduct blind culture assessments ahead of final equity deployment." The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. Someone cursed under their breath. The legal counsel asked whether it was reversible, whether Stonehaven was still open to negotiation. The representative smiled, faintly but without warmth. He was the one assigned to assess whether your people could align with ours. He was also authorized to initiate freeze protocols if internal conduct failed equity compatibility. The CFO's eyes narrowed. "You mean this wasn't a candidate?" "He never was," the man replied. "He's the one reviewing whether your board survives post-merger." Across the room, the color drained from the faces of those who had most enthusiastically pushed the deal forward without questioning who Alaric was or how he had appeared on the calendar. Somewhere in the background, the HR officer's phone buzzed with an alert from legal titled urgent. Candidate is Stonehaven partner. A mistake that never should have happened had already become a catalyst. Outside the glass walls of the meeting, word began to ripple across departments that the boardroom had locked down midday. Rumors sparked: cyber breach, audit, legal action. But none of them guessed the truth. Downstairs, Lucinda Griggs sat at her desk, flipping through applications for an upcoming mid-level position, completely unaware that her career had just turned to glass. She glanced up when Brenna passed her office, asked if she'd heard anything about the executive call. Brenna shook her head, said only that the invite list looked restricted. Lucinda dismissed it and returned to her notes, muttering something about another quota meeting and how they should start interviewing people who fit the culture. The irony hadn't yet reached her. Across the city, Alaric's sedan pulled into an underground garage beneath a different tower. This one, the regional headquarters of Stonehaven Capital. He stepped out past security without words and entered the elevator already expecting him. The receptionist stood as he approached and nodded. "The partners are waiting in room 6. The video had ended minutes earlier, but the sound of Lucinda Griggs's voice still echoed through every person present, a voice confident in its derision, casual in its cruelty, now documented, archived, and impossible to refute. The CEO of Eltridge and Keene, Everett Langford, a man known for his measured composure, sat motionless for a long beat before speaking. His voice was lower than usual, not hushed but weighted. He turned slightly to the head of compliance and asked who approved the vetting sequence for candidate-level interviews. The officer, pale and sweat-streaked, replied that HR had managed the process directly for internal alignment purposes, and no flags had been raised. The CFO added that none of them were aware of the full details surrounding the Stonehaven vetting pilot program. At that, the representative from Stonehaven calmly slid a document across the table toward Everett, who opened it slowly and read the letterhead before narrowing his eyes. His lips moved in silent recognition of the signature at the bottom, his own. It was a formal invitation dated 3 months prior, addressed to one Alaric D. Boone, confirming his designation as Strategic Integration Observer for the Culture and Values Validation process tied to the merger transition. The letter explicitly requested full autonomy in how, when, and where the observation would occur. Everett's hands went still. "I signed this," he said aloud, more to himself than to the room. "This came through my desk." The Stonehaven rep gave a single nod. Yes, as did the memo authorizing his presence on site without internal announcement. The silence deepened. The irony was now complete. Alaric had not just been known to them. He had been requested by them, trusted, and ignored. Downstairs, HR had not yet received word of what was unfolding above. Lucinda was in her office, reorganizing her schedule, preparing to meet with 2 external consultants about talent forecasting. She didn't notice the subtle ping from the internal scheduling system or the sudden addition of her name to a legal compliance calendar block. She was reviewing an email thread about candidate sourcing when Brenna entered her office, expression unreadable, and said, "You've been asked to join the boardroom upstairs." Immediately, Lucinda looked up, surprised but intrigued, assuming it related to final stage merger updates. She gathered her tablet, straightened her blazer, and followed without hesitation, never guessing the room she was walking into was no longer a place of prestige, but a courtroom in everything but name. When she entered, she froze. The lights were dimmed, the tone different. No small talk, no greetings. The executives were seated along one side of the table. On the opposite side sat the compliance officers, the in-house counsel, and the Stonehaven representative. She opened her mouth to speak, but Everett gestured for her to take a seat and said plainly, "We need you to walk us through your full experience with Mr. Boone this morning, from the moment he entered the building." Lucinda blinked. Her confidence faltered for the first time, not from guilt, but from confusion. He was a candidate," she began, then paused, glancing around, realizing with sudden unease that no one was nodding. "Was he not?" The legal counsel leaned forward and said, "He is an executive with Stonehaven, a senior partner, the primary compliance monitor for this acquisition." The sentence struck her like a dropped elevator. Her mouth opened, then closed. She tried to recover. "He didn't say that. He was listed on our schedule." Compliance interjected. "He was on the schedule under directive from the board, part of a classified evaluation test. Your responsibility was to execute the process with discretion and neutrality." Lucinda's pulse began to rise. She struggled to remember everything she'd said, everything she'd laughed at, everyone she'd shared those comments with. Then she remembered the lobby, the intern, the water, the remark about the buffer machine. He never identified himself, she tried. The Stonehaven rep replied coldly. He was not obligated to. That was the point. Everett asked her directly, "Did you read the Stonehaven memo that came with the candidate protocol?" She shook her head. "It never reached me." "It was sent and opened on your login." The truth closed in like tightening walls. Her attempt to redirect the conversation fell flat. Every effort to spin the narrative came back empty. The facts were too clear, the evidence too direct, the fallout already in motion. The message was brutally concise. Effective immediately, Lucinda Griggs is placed on indefinite leave pending formal termination, proceedings following substantiated findings of discriminatory conduct and failure to uphold organizational ethical standards during classified executive vetting. Below that, a second line cut even deeper. Severance package revoked. All benefits suspended. Access terminated. Her corporate profile had already been pulled from the internal directory. Her name removed from calendar invites. Her access card deactivated at 6:47 p.m. No escort had been necessary. She was still in her chair when the system logged her out remotely. 1 minute she had been a leader. The next, she was merely an example. Downstairs, word had already begun to move beyond whispers. Employees who had once nodded politely now avoided her gaze. The laughter that used to follow her casual cruelty had evaporated. People walked faster when passing her door. Her assistant Brenna had already left for the day, quietly, without saying goodbye. The Stonehaven representative hadn't spoken to her since the hearing. He hadn't needed to. The video spoke louder than any rebuke ever could. And now, as Lucinda refreshed her inbox one final time, she saw the fallout had already begun. 2 consulting firms she freelanced for on the side had sent termination notices, citing brand alignment concerns. A keynote event she had been scheduled to headline at a diversity conference next month had pulled her name from the roster without explanation. And a recruiter she once mentored had sent a one-line email that read, "I suggest you lay low for a while." She closed the tablet, folded her hands, and stared at the plaque on her desk. Champion of Workplace Culture, 2021. The irony struck like a cold hand across her face. Meanwhile, in the upper floors of Eltridge and Keene's executive wing, the boardroom had shifted into containment mode. A second list had been finalized, a short roster of senior leaders whose involvement in the Alaric Boone interview had placed them under scrutiny. Elliot Duval, the VP of Finance, had been the most vocal during the session. His comments questioning whether Alaric could read or had authored his own resume had not only embarrassed the firm, but created direct liability. The compliance report stated clearly that his participation in future merger-related strategy would be untenable. He was removed from the integration committee before nightfall. His corporate shares, which had been part of his incentive package tied to the merger's success, were retracted under the ethics clause. When informed, he had protested, calling the response disproportionate, but was silenced when informed that the company's largest investor had explicitly demanded the restructuring as a condition of continued engagement. The woman in emerald, who had barely spoken during the interview, but had been observed laughing when Lucinda mocked Alaric's background, received a notice of disciplinary alignment reevaluation and was asked to step down from her advisory role within the diversity hiring board. Others, like Grayson Holt, whose pen tapping and phone checking had conveyed disinterest, if not direct offense, found their performance bonuses frozen pending internal review. For the first time in the company's decade-long history, behavioral alignment became a quantifiable factor in the executive scorecard, not just a slogan. But the most immediate blow came to the merger itself. Stonehaven Capital, whose investment had been structured around shared leadership and post-acquisition equity options, submitted a revised term sheet. The updated version removed all Eltridge and Keene internal decision-makers from the final governance model. Instead, Stonehaven would absorb the firm as a subsidiary with no board-level retention guarantees. It was a hostile restructuring in all but name. The CEO, Everett Langford, who had personally signed off on Alaric's inclusion in the process, was allowed to retain his title temporarily, but only as a transitional figurehead. His influence, however, was gone. The real control had shifted, and the employees could feel it. They could feel it in the sudden silence around the HR floor, in the emergency meeting notices that skipped mid-level managers, in the quiet removal of names from office doors, and in the whisper that someone had finally answered the question. What happens when power pretends it cannot see? 1 year later, the skyline above the Eltridge and Keene building looked the same. Glass high-rises reflecting the sunlight in perfect angles, traffic humming below, and polished walkways filled with well-dressed professionals, moving between towers like currents in a well-oiled machine. But inside the structure, much had changed. The company had completed its full integration into Stonehaven Capital's portfolio, rebranded under the new structure with a firm-wide emphasis on ethics, equity, and transparency. Every wall that once held portraits of founding partners now displayed framed manifestos on inclusive leadership. The HR department had been gutted and rebuilt from the ground up, overseen by an entirely new committee comprised of internal and external experts, including 3 consultants hired not for who they knew, but for what they had survived. And yet, it was not within this building that the most striking change could be found. It was 25 blocks away, in a modest brick structure tucked between a community library and a health clinic, that a woman named Lucinda Griggs stood wiping down a folding table in preparation for a job readiness seminar. She wore no blazer, no heels, no designer pin. Her once pristine posture was softer now, her tone quieter, not defeated, but aware. The building belonged to the Langston Initiative, a nonprofit founded to support professionals of color who had faced systemic discrimination in corporate hiring pipelines. Lucinda volunteered there every Tuesday and Thursday, helping review resumes, practice interviews, and conduct mock evaluations, not from behind a desk of power, but seated across the table, eye to eye, like an equal. It hadn't happened overnight. After her dismissal, Lucinda had vanished from the executive circuit. Recruiters blacklisted her. Agencies passed over her profile. Speaking engagements disappeared. At first, she denied, then deflected, then disappeared entirely. But 6 months after her fall, during a long walk through the industrial district she used to avoid, she stopped outside the Langston Initiative's entrance and stared at the banner in the window that read, "Opportunity is not a favor. It's a right." She didn't walk in that day. It took her 3 more visits just to cross the threshold. But once she did, she didn't leave. At first, she helped file papers, organize records, bring coffee. Later, she asked to sit in on mock sessions. Then she asked to run them. No one welcomed her with open arms. She earned nothing automatically, but she showed up, week after week, month after month, quiet, present, listening, until eventually, people no longer whispered her name with accusation, but with curiosity. By the time the Langston board asked her to join their planning committee, she had already written 3 white papers on unconscious bias in mid-level hiring, one of which was cited in a state-level labor commission hearing. Now, standing in front of a circle of young professionals preparing for corporate entry, Lucinda spoke not as a mentor, but as a cautionary tale. She didn't read from notes. She didn't dramatize. She told the truth. I once believed competence had a look, a sound, a shape. That belief cost me everything. And worse, it cost others their chance. The room stayed silent. No applause. No pity. Just understanding. Later that month, at a national conference on organizational restructuring, Lucinda was invited to speak, not in the keynote slot, but on a panel titled Failures That Built Frameworks. She accepted. She traveled there by train, stayed in a modest hotel, and wore a plain gray dress. When it was her turn to speak, she told the full story, not just of what happened at Eltridge and Keene, but what led her there, the culture that reinforced her mindset, the power that went unchecked, the moments she laughed when she should have spoken. She ended her speech with a quote from the same man she once mocked. Silence is not weakness. Observation is not surrender. Power, when quiet, cuts deepest. She did not name Alaric Boone. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew. Meanwhile, across the country in Seattle, Alaric sat in a strategy meeting for a new Stonehaven acquisition. This one a tech firm with a diverse but undervalued leadership pipeline. He didn't speak much during the session. He listened, took notes, and asked questions others didn't think to ask. Afterward, a junior associate approached him and said, "You have a reputation, you know. People say you're the man who broke a company with a phone call." Alaric smiled faintly and said, "I didn't break anything. I just let the truth breathe." Later that evening, in his hotel room, he received a forwarded video. It was a clip from Lucinda's panel. He watched it without comment, then hit replay. Twice. He didn't share it. He didn't respond. But he did close his laptop a little slower than usual. A month later, the Langston Initiative received an anonymous endowment from a private donor, enough to fund 5 years of programming, scholarships for displaced professionals, and the opening of 2 satellite locations. No note, no contact, just a wire transfer, and a line in the ledger marked restoration. Back in the city, the plaque that once read Champion of Workplace Culture was removed from Eltridge and Keane's walls. In its place, a new plaque was installed. It bore no names, no titles. Only a quote engraved in steel: "We are measured not by whom we welcome, but by whom we ignore." The end. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to stay updated on more powerful narratives like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was there a moment that made you stop and think? And let us know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below and join the conversation. Your voice matters here.